This next one is significantly shorter. Let's do it quickly. This is your final normal timeline, timeline 16, Cold War II. Okay? Cold War II is about essentially the end and deconstruction of the Cold War and the tiny little uprisings that happen after it. Above it, let's do 1940 and 2000 again. And up top, starting the very top, starting at 1945 with the end of Cold War, with the end of World War II, and going until 1990-ish, the end of the Cold War. This is the Cold War. Let's split it. Give me that first third, and this is essentially communism fails. It's labeled as a third. That means it's a third. So in Eastern Europe, in order for the communists to maintain and keep a lot of control, they make a lot of these countries dictatorships. All right. The countries that fall into a dictatorship after World War II are going to be Poland, Hungary, and Romania. Now, after Stalin, you don't need to know every Soviet premier, but you need to know Stalin started it, of course. After Stalin, who's the guy in charge? Khrushchev. Nikita Khrushchev, all right? Now, he's the guy in charge during Cuban Missile Crisis, kind of the formally finishes the Berlin Wall and some other stuff. But most famously, when he first takes power, he gives a speech and he announces a new policy for the Soviet Union called what? De-Stalinization. Now, de-Stalinization is where you pull back some of the super strict controls that the Soviet Union exerts over its satellite countries. It creates a little more freedom for individuals in those Eastern European Soviet bloc countries behind the Iron Curtain. What is the result of that, though? Give them a little bit, they want a lot, all right? So they have several revolts. The most famous of these revolts was in 1956, and it was in what country? Hungary, very good. That's the water polo team. Now, there are some peaceful revolts. This is towards the end of the Soviet Union, but there are some countries with peaceful results. The most famous of these is in what country? Poland. And the Polish revolts remain peaceful because they're organized and they have one other major influence, okay? So for Poland, there's two reasons this revolt is going to stay peaceful and be successful. The biggest one is something called solidarity. Solidarity is what they call a general workers' union, which means it's a union, but not for a specific job. It's for many of the working class people. It's really popular, it's really big, and it's relatively well organized. So they can organize revolts, they can organize protests without violence and all this other junk. But the other big factor for Poland was who? It was John Paul II, who was Roman Catholic Church, or just Roman Catholic Pope, right? He helped organize and keep the revolutions as peaceful, to call out hypocrisy in the Soviet rule, and to try and get the government to step down. The last of the major Soviet premiers is who? There's one or two people after him, but Gorbachev is the one that matters. Gorbachev introduces two new policies. Both of these weaken the extreme control that the Soviet Union has had. They are called perestroika and glasnost. Perestroika and glasnost. I forget which is which. If I get it backwards, it's okay. But one of these, I think perestroika, is a lessening of economic controls. So a little bit more economic freedom. That's when like Pizza Hut and Pepsi make their way into the Soviet Union. And glasnost is less censorship in government. So it's more freedom of speech for people. both of these end up with more liberations and more freedom in the Soviet bloc, and will help lead to the downfall of the Soviet Union and the end of their control over these satellite states. After the Soviet Union falls, most of the countries in that Eastern Bloc move to capitalism. They move to capitalism and some sort of elected governments. Most famous people that do this are the Czechs, Slovaks, and the Yugoslavians. And to complete their break with the Soviet Union, most of these groups will form a country, and that country will join what? The EU. Not all of them will join NATO, but most of them will join the EU. Next color. You can use the rest of your space underneath this. I don't know what else to call it, so I called it intellectuals and politics. Over here, we've had this era of industrialization through the 1800s into the 1900s. We saw the impact of industrialization in many ways with World War I. After World War II, we see the height of industrialization. That's the consumer economy, where everything is defined by buying things. But when we get to the 1950s, especially the 60s and the 70s, we start to move against that heavy industry. Always think about it, there's about the time that the Cleveland River caught on fire, all right? People have a problem with it. Most of those people are going to be grouped into green parties. These are people that push back against the massive, what are the buzzwords here? Massive consumerism and globalization. They get a frowny face. That's an awful frowny face. So they push back against consumerism and globalization. They're going to push back against big coal-burning factories in the middle of cities. They're going to push back against pollution. And their goal is going to be what we call sustainable development. And that is, of course, still going on rather heavily, especially when you look at the energy sector. This in the 60s and 70s is when nuclear power became bigger and bigger, because in many ways it's much more environmentally friendly than like coal or natural gas burning power plants. Now we moved on to wind and solar, stuff like that. Another big impact in the 60s was their hippies, okay? Their hippies come to a head with the youth revolts of 1968. And all you need to know about the youth revolts of 1968 is essentially categorize them in with our college and youth revolts, such as Kent State. They were pushing it back against war, against consumerism. We don't call them hippies, though. We call them counterculture. This is the counterculture movement, and they also gave a big frowny face to materialism. Next color. Nationalists and separatists. There's not too big of a difference between these two groups, but here's how I want you to picture it, okay? After World War I and World War II, we saw the end of imperialism. We saw the end of big European countries, Western countries, I should say, including America, losing control of the essentially sovereign states, losing control of Vietnam and India and most of the individual African countries. They earned their independence. But after those formal countries get their independence, there's then groups of people within larger countries that believe they should have independence too. We're about to talk about like the Irish and some other, the Basque region in northern Spain, Catalonia around Barcelona. These are the smaller groups. Most of them aren't successful because they're too small, but they start a heavier movement here. The most famous groups here are Ireland. Ireland, of course, creates the IRA, the Irish Republican Army, that pushes throughout the 1900s, all the way up until 1998 in the Good Friday Agreement, for more independence for Ireland. They still exist. Ireland is still split. There's still a Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, the rest of the island. But Ireland, and then there's a region in Russia on the south side, okay? It starts with a C. not Crimea, though that's technically now in Russia because of Ukraine. It's Chechnya. Chechnya also pushes further independence. The problem is they're pushing for independence against Putin, and Putin doesn't exactly let them go. There are other regions where these fights aren't exactly equal, where when countries split up and divide, the larger populations simply try to erase the smaller populations. Both of the examples I'm going to give are where in Europe. In the Balkans, more specifically as Yugoslavia breaks up, some of the smaller minority groups are really going to be either mass killed or pushed to the side. Most famous are the Bosnian Muslims. Most famous are the Albanian Muslims. The Albanian Muslims are mostly segregated to what area? You've heard of it. It starts with a K. Kosovo. On the other side, separatists, there's like 3 or 4 examples. I'm only going to put one in your head. It's from the northern region of Spain. It's in the Basque region. It's in the Basque region, and the group that fights for independence is the ETA. There's also a famous one in southeastern Spain. It's called the Catalonian region. It includes Barcelona. They actually tried to vote for independence, I want to say about 10 years ago, but Spain can never let them go. Barcelona is way too valuable. And the last color, just a couple words. We are back to European identity. So I want you to put the Maastricht Treaty in your head. The Maastricht Treaty doesn't set up all 3 of these things. It essentially only sets up the EU, but I want you to tie it together. These are the final stages we talk about where Europe has become more united. Economically, how has Europe become super united today? With the euro, which ironically put a dollar sign next to it if that helps you remember it. The euro is a currency. So they all the countries except for Switzerland and some that aren't in the EU follow the euro. England never did because their currency was too valuable. They also create within the European Union, they create the European Parliament. And what I mean by that, again, is in 200 years, there will be a president of Europe. He will be elected probably on or she will probably be elected for 4-year terms. They will probably have a Congress called the European Parliament. There's probably going to be 2 branches of that, 2 houses of that Congress. One is going to be a house where every country in Europe gets 2 representatives, and one with the bigger countries will have more representatives, right? That's essentially where Europe is heading. And as a unified Europe, they will become a superpower like America, China, and arguably India. The last thing they do is the free movement of people. That's one of the big hits for Great Britain as they Brexit, as they pull out of the EU, because now they need passport checks to go to different countries, whereas before it was not unlike traveling from Ohio to Kentucky. That's it. That's your last formal timeline. Thank you. I love you. Good night.